July the 26th, 2010. What began as an ordinary Dublin evening turned into one of the bloodiest nights in Irish criminal history. Outside the Players' Lounge pub in Fairview, chaos erupted, a night that would etch fear into the city streets forever. From the shadows, a figure dressed in black steps out of a waiting car, twin pistols glinting in the dim streetlights. Without hesitation, he raises both weapons and unleashes a hail of bullets at a crowded pub entrance. 3 men, Brian Masterson, Wayne Barrett and Austin Purcell, were hit severely. There's blood pooled on the pavement as panicked patrons scramble for cover, their laughter and conversation replaced by screams and panicked cries. But who could have orchestrated such a bold and ruthless attack? The answer lies in a sinister world where bullets send messages and fear is currency. The attack was meant to send a message, and the perpetrator was none other than a member of the Wilsons, a family of hitmen who knew no limits to brutality. This time, the intended target, real IRA figure Alan Ryan, had been in the Wilson family's crosshairs, and in their ruthless pursuit, they showed no regard for collateral damage. As the assailant disappeared into the night, Dublin's criminal underworld reeled from the brazen assault. It wasn't just an act of violence, it was a declaration of war. This was the world of the Wilson family, a dynasty of crime that thrived on fear and chaos. From calculated assassination plots to reckless displays of brutality, their reign left a permanent scar on Ireland. But how did this family rise to such power? And what led to their eventual downfall? To understand, we must unravel the tangled web of greed, betrayal and ambition that defined their legacy. John, Keith, Alan, Eric and Luke Wilson. These men didn't just terrorise the Irish underworld, but also threatened the state's pillars. Did they meet their justice for their heinous crimes, or remain outside the law's reach for long? Let's find out by jumping into the lives of these guns for hire, who made the brutal world of the Irish narcotic underworld a lot more violent. Alan Wilson's story begins on the streets of Dublin, a city where crime wasn't just a livelihood, but a way of life for many. Born into a family already deeply entrenched in the criminal underworld, Alan's path seemed preordained. Nephew of notorious gangster Martin the General Cahill, Alan's connections ran deep, not just to some small-time offenders, but to some of Ireland's most infamous figures. Among them, the Kinahan Cartel, a name synonymous with organised crime and violence, became both his patrons and partners. By the time he reached his early 20s, Alan had already made a name for himself. Known for his charm and intelligence, he was as calculated a criminal, able to switch seamlessly between roles. One moment, he was a doting family man. The next, a cold-hearted hitman, capable of orchestrating attacks that left entire communities in fear. The attack at the Players' Lounge in Fairview in 2010 marked a turning point in his criminal career. For Garda, the case pointers were a man dressed in black and a Volkswagen Golf. As for the victims, Wayne Barrett was the doorman, while Brian Masterson and Austin Purcell were patrons. Initially, the Garda had some trouble identifying the culprit, but the investigation eventually led them to Alan Wilson. But only after some 7 years. CCTV captured the assailant holding weapons in both hands, but Wilson denied being the shooter, claiming he was merely a facilitator, someone who sourced weapons and vehicles. In 2017, during surveillance of a separate assassination plot, Alan boasted to an associate, "Remember the shooting at the Players' Lounge? I'd done that." These damning words, captured on tape, would later seal his fate. In another conversation, he said, "One of them, right in the forehead and 5 times in the body. It's amazing how the cunts pulled through it, like." But Alan's confidence became his Achilles heel. He revelled in the power he wielded and the fear his name invoked. This arrogance blinded him to the tightening net of authorities, which had began using advanced surveillance techniques to monitor the Kinahan cartel's activities. After this crystal clear proof of his crime, Alan had no other option but to take a plea deal. He pled guilty to conspiracy to eliminate in exchange for the prosecution dropping 3 attempted elimination charges. Wilson wrote a letter to the Director of Public Prosecutions admitting involvement in the planning and organisation of the Players' Lounge execution attempts. In the letter, Wilson said he had sourced the weapons and vehicles used and provided information about the getaway route and where to burn out the Volkswagen Golf used by the assailant. During the court proceedings, Wilson denied that he was the assailant or that he was in the Volkswagen Golf. He said that he was acting on the instructions of dissident Republicans and accepted that his role as a planner made his involvement deeper and more sinister. He also pleaded guilty to an offence under the Firearms Act of possession of 2 weapons, while pleading not guilty to the attempted assassinations of Brian Masterson, Wayne Barrett and Austin Purcell at the Players Lounge. He was sentenced to 10 years. The Players Lounge attack wasn't just another hit gone wrong. It was a chilling display of Alan's ambition, a desperate attempt to solidify his standing within the Kinahan cartel, regardless of the lives destroyed in the process. Behind bars, Alan would claim to have turned over a new leaf. He spoke of poetry and redemption, presenting himself as a man transformed by incarceration. He claimed leniency in his prison conditions based on this change. But these claims fell apart when his violent tendencies resurfaced. He was unsafe in prison, as a Gangland hitman would be, especially when he had participated in numerous gang feuds. His suspicions weren't wrong, and he was attacked in jail in 2019 after getting drugged. He survived the attack, but became paranoid after that. He even sued the prison authorities for this attack. His paranoia grew over time, leading him to lash out at a prison staff when he didn't recognise the wardens guarding him. It must be very hard to be a prison officer, wouldn't it? Crime reporter Nicola Tallant agrees. Here is what Tallant and award-winning journalist Eamon Dillon had to say on the subject.
You know, I think it must be one of the hardest jobs in the world to be a prison officer and to be dealing with people who are just, first of all, you know, living in such unnatural circumstances. They're locked up, their movements are restricted. It must be so high octane. And I'm sure every day somebody lashes out.
Look at the last Prison Officers Association General Conference there earlier this year. I mean, they talked about the number of assaults were up. I mean, part of that was things were a bit quieter, believe it or not, during lockdown, during COVID. And so there was a bit of a surge again as more drugs got back into the prison.
Coming back to Alan Wilson, his assaults on prison staff, his paranoia about bounties on his head, and his involvement in conspiracies, even while incarcerated, showed that even in prison, your actions catch up with you. That being said, how were the other Wilsons compared to Alan? Alan Wilson may be the most infamous, but he's far from the only member of the criminal dynasty to leave a lasting stain on Ireland's underworld. The Wilsons' notoriety spans multiple generations, with each member contributing their unique brand of ruthlessness to the family legacy. Alan's cousins Eric, Keith and John Wilson, the notorious 3 Wilson brothers, formed the backbone of this dynasty. Eric Lucky Wilson earned his moniker from his uncanny ability to escape justice for years, even as he left a bloody trail of victims across Ireland and Europe. His crimes were bold and savage, the kind that sent shivers through the community. From a young age, Eric proved to be a relentless force, culminating in his conviction for eliminating British expat Dan Smith in a Spanish bar in 2010. Eric had moved to Spain in the 2000s to avoid Garda scrutiny and expand his illicit activities. But before his sentence in Spain, Eric had already been implicated in more than a dozen gangland killings, one of which included the attempted execution of Douglas Turner in 2007. Eric's connections to other eliminations, including the disappearance of David Lindsay and Alan Napper in Northern Ireland, had long been suspected but remains unproven. His use of false identities and international networks allowed him to avoid capture for years. Here are his other shocking crimes.
And Eric Wilson once shot a man dead in cold blood after arranging to sell his victim a gun for his own protection. Former drug dealer Roy Coddington paid the ultimate price after approaching Wilson when he received a death threat from dissident Republican extortionists who he had no money to pay.
Nevertheless, he was sentenced to 23 years for taking out Smith. The 2 men had got into a row after Smith complained about Wilson's misbehaviour with a young woman at a bar. Now comes out the next Wilson gun for hire. Keith Wilson, Eric's brother, followed a similarly destructive path. In 2010, he was hired to eliminate Daniel Gaynor, a former Real IRA member suspected of carrying out rival gangs' orders. Keith ambushed Gaynor in broad daylight on Finglas Street as the latter walked with his girlfriend and 2 children. The scene was horrific. Keith hit Gaynor in the neck, who died instantly. Witnesses, including children, were left traumatised by the brutal assassination. Keith's arrogance and lack of foresight led to his arrest. The investigators found DNA from a white cotton glove at the crime scene. Thanks to the amazing late Deputy Superintendent Com Fox, who masterminded a plan to obtain Wilson's DNA, a weapon, Cap and Hoodie were also left at the scene by the hitman. Can you imagine the hitman's carelessness? It's like he was challenging the authorities to arrest him. Nevertheless, DNA was recovered from the 3 recovered items. The next step was to attain Wilson's DNA, which was hard because he had refused to provide any samples. But Wilson had come in for questioning. After an exercise break during the process, 3 Marlboro cigarettes were recovered. These proved to be his undoing. After the examination, all 3 samples from the cigs matched the DNA on the weapon, cap, glove and hoodie. Now, before you judge the criminal for his borderline stupidity, just know that collecting evidence through DNA wasn't that common at the time. In fact, this was the first time a cigarette was used to collect DNA. Nevertheless, the man was sent to prison after the discovery of this incriminating evidence. This was around the same time his brother Eric received his sentence. Notably, Eric was also a Kinahan associate who took out Paddy Doyle on the cartel's behalf in 2008. Doyle was accused by the Kinahans for the disappearance of up to €500,000 of cartel cash. You're not going to believe this, but Wilson flew to Belfast the same summer to take out another narcotic trafficker, David Babyface Lindsay, and his associate, Alan Napper, making his 5th contract slaying. Lindsay had a feud with Micah the Panda Kelly, who lured the pair to their death on the pretense of paying them the amount he owed. Wilson was also suspected of having eliminated addict turned hitman Christy Gilroy for Eamon Dunn in 2009 to avoid Gilroy turning state's evidence if arrested. Moreover, he was the chief suspect in the disappearance and apparent execution of Alan Campbell in the south of Spain. Intelligence indicated Wilson would bury his victims in lime-lined pits so that they would decompose more quickly. He also consumed coke in large quantities, which explained his desperation to earn money. At the height of his rampage across Ireland, he was demanding a kilo of coke worth around €70,000 if sold on the streets as his hit fee. Irish Sun cited a source. He was taking a kilo as payment, and it was for his own personal use, not to sell onwards. Everyone we spoke to told us that if and when you do catch up with him, he won't be taken alive. Nevertheless, he was brought to justice eventually. It appears that prison didn't agree with Keith. In 2011, he went ballistic after prison officers caught him with a mobile phone. Notably, he was to be transferred to a high-security prison for 2 months after being found in possession of a phone, but when he learned about this development, he became violent and smashed the prison cell up. It looks like clearly he didn't want to be sent to Portlaoise. However, later in jail, Keith had deviated from his cousin's path. Said to be a model prisoner, he applied for parole in 2022. He was given a day release on compassionate grounds and was accompanied by 3 officers. He had been keeping his nose clean and following every rule. However, according to the prison sources, he was not on an early release program, but heading in that direction. Now comes the eldest Wilson brother, John, the man responsible for starting the family business of paid assassination. His violent tendencies were notorious, even in Dublin's hardened criminal circles. John also participated in the 2010 Players' Lounge attack. He was arrested initially, but then let go. However, his criminal career and life ended violently in 2012, eliminated in his home of Ballyfermot. John had been estranged from a powerful crime boss who decided he was no longer an asset, leaving John vulnerable. On the day of his elimination, he was attacked in front of his 7-year-old daughter, a grim reminder of the blood-soaked lives of the Wilsons led. The youngest generation was no less determined to carry the family torch. Luke Wilson, Alan's nephew, idolised his uncles and sought to emulate their violent legacies. In 2013, his own best friend, Patrick McCann, attempted to eliminate him, shooting him 3 times during a confrontation in a park. Luke survived, but lost an eye and suffered permanent physical impairments. Undeterred, he became a foot soldier for the Kinahan Cartel, eager to prove himself. In 2017, Luke was arrested with a loaded weapon and a silencer as he plotted to eliminate Gary Hanley, a Hutch gang associate. During the investigation, surveillance tape captured Luke snorting coke and casually discussing collateral damage. "Baby or no baby, I don't give a fuck," he said, dismissing the risk to innocent lives. This was the same elimination plot surveillance that led to Alan's incarceration. While each family member contributed to the Wilson legacy in their own violent way, Alan was the linchpin that held their stories together. His connections to the Kinahan cartel provided a support system for his cousins, nephews and brothers to act with impunity. Together, they were not just a family, but an organised syndicate of hitmen for hire. Their brutal efficiency made them valuable assets for criminal enterprises, but it also drew the intense focus of authorities. The Wilson family's reign extended beyond physical violence. They used intimidation to control those around them, ensuring loyalty through fear. Even from behind bars, Alan and his relatives wielded influence. Threats against prison staff, orchestrated attacks, and strategic lawsuits kept their names in the headlines and their enemies on edge. But this dynasty was far from united. Like many criminal families, the Wilsons were plagued by internal rivalries, betrayals, and paranoia. Alan himself was not immune to these fractures. After his arrest in 2017, graffiti began appearing in Mountjoy prison, signalling that Alan's former allies in the Kinahan cartel had turned against him. Bounties of €100,000 for his execution and €20,000 for cutting him marked him as a target. These betrayals exposed cracks in the once unshakable foundations of the Wilson Empire. These Wilsons weren't just criminals. They were a dynasty of destruction, spanning generations and stretching across borders. Their notoriety was built on a shared commitment to violence and a disregard for the lives they destroyed. But as their empire grew, so did the forces determined to dismantle it. During Alan Wilson's appearance before the criminal court, he claimed he had been recruited by dissident Republicans in the conspiracy to eliminate Plot. It turned out that Alan and his cousin John were recruited by cigarette smuggler and veteran Republican Sean Hunt. Hunt had made millions from smuggling cigarettes into Ireland and was engaged in a bitter feud with the real IRA. The IRA gang ordered the elimination of Colm Colley Owens, who was friendly with some members of the Ballyfermot mob. That included the Wilson brothers and major criminal Mark Guinea Pig Desmond, among other serious criminals. The suspect for attacking Owens was Daniel Gaynor, a notorious hitman. Infuriated by the execution of Owens, the Ballyfermot mob decided Gaynor had to be targeted, and on August 14, 2010, the hitman was hit in the neck. However, Keith Wilson, the assailant, landed in trouble for this attack due to his inexperience, leaving crucial evidence at the scene. Hunt was taken out in 2012 himself after accusing Ryan of keeping the proceeds from extortion rackets. If you weren't convinced before, these events must be enough to know how crazy the world of crime is. As for John's death, the hit was carried out by Keith O'Neill, a young gunman promised €40,000 for the job, a promise that was never fulfilled. John's death, in front of his daughter no less, sent shockwaves through the Wilson family and marked a turning point in their criminal trajectory. In prison, Alan Wilson faced the repercussions of these betrayals more acutely than ever. The graffiti in Mountjoy prison and the bounties on his head were not idle threats. Alan had once been a loyal soldier for the Kinahan cartel, but his value diminished as alliances shifted. He became a marked man, another reminder of how expendable even the most loyal enforcers could be in the underworld. In their quest for dominance, the Wilsons also turned their wrath on those who dared to cross them. Alan's paranoia became a weapon, targeting not just rivals, but anyone he perceived as a threat. In 2012, a letter was discovered in his prison cell, instructing his mother to recruit an associate to neutralise a solicitor. The note included detailed instructions and promised €10,000 for the hit. When the plot was uncovered, Alan dismissed it as desperation, but it revealed the lengths to which he would go to eliminate his enemies. Even within the family, fractures appeared. Luke Wilson's attempted execution at the hands of his best friend, Patrick McGann, in 2013 was rooted in a personal feud that spiralled out of control. McGann, angered by a dispute, shot Luke 3 times and left him for dead. These feuds weren't just about survival. They were about power, control, and the ruthless pursuit of dominance. The Wilsons thrived in a world where violence was currency and loyalty was a fleeting commodity. But as their enemies multiplied and their allies turned against them, the cracks in their empire began to show. The family's feuds weren't just battles. They were the seeds of their eventual downfall. Nevertheless, even in prison, the Wilsons decided to fight the system. Alan's violent streak extended to his interactions with prison staff. In 2019, he was transferred to the Midlands prison after attacking an officer at Mountjoy, an incident fueled by paranoia over a bounty on his head. This wasn't an isolated event. Over the years, Alan racked up more than 10 disciplinary reports for threatening jail staff. His behaviour ranged from verbal intimidation to physical altercations, making him one of the prison system's most volatile inmates. One of Alan's most audacious moves was suing the Irish Prison Service over a 2019 knife attack that left him with severe facial scars. Alan alleged that prison officials failed to act on his warnings about a €100,000 bounty placed on his head by the Kinahan cartel. For Alan Wilson, violence wasn't just a means to an end, it was the end itself. His schemes, whether orchestrated on the streets or from his cell, demonstrated a relentless pursuit of dominance. Each plot, each threat, each act of brutality added to the Wilson family's reputation as a dynasty built on fear. But Alan's story was far from over, and his actions continue to ripple through the lives of those caught in his wake. It looks like his nephew is trying to follow in his footsteps, even in prison. He also gave prison authorities a tough time, threatening staff and scuffling with other prisoners. Now that we discussed each Wilson family member's fate briefly, what were they doing when they were not taking out people on contract? Eric Wilson's criminal career epitomised the Wilson family's reach. Eric's move to Spain in the late 2000s was more than an escape from the Garda scrutiny. It was a strategic relocation. Spain's Costa del Sol had long been a haven for organised crime, and Eric quickly embedded himself in its murky underworld. Operating under false identities, he orchestrated eliminations and narcotic operations while maintaining ties to Irish crime groups. Eric's activities weren't confined to Spain. Investigators linked him to a series of assassinations and narcotic operations in Ireland and in the UK. His connections to the Kinahan Cartel and South American suppliers enabled him to facilitate coke shipments into Europe, a lucrative enterprise that underpinned much of the Wilson family's wealth. Keith Wilson, Eric's brother, played a crucial role in consolidating the family's influence in Ireland. His operations demonstrated the family's reliance on local networks, as he worked closely with veteran crime bosses, including figures involved in cigarette smuggling and extortion. These alliances provided the resources and protection the Wilsons needed to thrive, but they also created dependencies that would later unravel. Beyond Ireland and Spain, the Wilsons established links to other criminal organisations. Alan's ties to the Kinahan cartel were pivotal, giving the family access to an international network of enforcers, traffickers and corrupt officials. But the Wilsons' criminal web was not invincible. Authorities kept on their tail as they tried to outmaneuver them. In Spain, the Guardia Civil dismantled part of Eric's operations, seizing assets and arresting associates. In Ireland, the Garda National Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau used innovative surveillance techniques to intercept the family's plots, including the Gary Hanley assassination attempt. Each arrest, each seizure chipped away at the Wilsons' power. Despite these setbacks, the Wilsons remained a formidable force. Their operations weren't compartmentalised, ensuring that no single arrest could dismantle the entire network. This strategy, borrowed from larger syndicates like the Kinahan cartel, allowed the family to continue functioning even as key members faced imprisonment. For years, the Wilson family thrived on the fear they instilled and the alliances they forged. But as their criminal empire expanded, so too did the scrutiny of the authorities. The family's downfall was not the result of one dramatic effect, but a slow unravelling caused by escalating violence and relentless investigations. Alan Wilson's arrest in 2017 for his role in the Gary Hanley assassination plot marked the beginning of the end for the family's dominance. The meticulous surveillance operation that led to his capture was a masterstroke by the Garda National Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau. Listening devices planted in the gang's vehicles captured Alan and his associates, discussing every detail of the planned hit, leaving no room for ambiguity. This evidence was instrumental in Alan's conviction, dealing a significant blow to the family's operations. While Alan's imprisonment was a critical moment, it was not the final chapter. The Wilsons' semi-autonomous network structure allowed their activities to continue, albeit at a diminished capacity. Eric Wilson, despite serving a 23-year sentence in Spain, was suspected of maintaining influence over some of the family's operations. However, his incarceration in a foreign prison made it increasingly difficult to coordinate their criminal activities. Keith Wilson's life sentence for the elimination of Daniel Gaynor further weakened the family's position. Keith had been a key enforcer for the Wilsons, and his removal from the streets of Dublin created a vacuum that rivals were quick to exploit. The family's once formidable reputation began to waver as other criminal factions encroached on their territory. The most significant factor in the Wilsons' downfall, however, was the shifting alliances within the criminal underworld. The Kinahan cartel, once their powerful benefactor, began distancing itself from the family. Alan's behaviour in prison further tarnished the family's legacy. His violent outbursts, legal battles and conspiracies revealed a man desperate to cling to relevance. His lawsuits against the Irish prison service, while highlighting the threats he faced, also exposed his vulnerability. The once feared hitman was now a prisoner fighting for survival in a system that had finally caught up with him. By the early 2020s, the Wilson family's empire was in ruins. Their criminal network, once sprawling and powerful, had been reduced to remnants. The family's story had shifted from one of dominance to one of decline, a reproving tale of how even the most formidable criminal empires can crumble under the weight of their own excesses. Yet, the scars left by the Wilsons remain. Communities across Ireland continue to feel the impact of their reign of terror. Families shattered by violence, neighbourhoods destabilised by their activities, and a legacy of fear are the enduring reminders of the Wilsons' time at the top. While their empires may have fallen, their story serves as a warning to the devastation wrought by organised crime. In Dublin, neighbourhoods like Ballyfermot and Finglas bore the brunt of the family's actions. These were the epicentres of their operations, where their violent schemes unfolded and their feuds erupted. Families were left grieving loved ones lost to the Wilsons' ruthless tactics. Children who witnessed eliminations, like the 7-year-old daughter of John Wilson, were left with lifelong trauma. The Wilsons' reign destabilised entire communities, creating an atmosphere of fear that lingered long after their arrests. The psychological toll extended also beyond their immediate victim. The Wilson family's willingness to target anyone who crossed them sent shockwaves through the underworld. Rivals, associates, and even authorities lived under the shadow of potential retaliation. Garda officers tasked with investigating the Wilsons faced threats and intimidation, both direct and implied. For prison staff, interactions with Wilson family members were fraught with danger. Luke Wilson's threats to a Mountjoy officer, promising to harm his children, highlighted the family's reach and the lengths they would go to maintain their grip on power. The Wilsons' influence also extended into Ireland's broader criminal landscape, fueling a culture of violence that escalated conflicts and destabilised alliances. Their involvement in the Kinahan-Hutch feud amplified the death toll of one of Ireland's most notorious gang wars. The attempted assassination of Gary Hanley at the Players' Lounge attack were just two of the high-profile incidents that marked the Wilsons as central figures in this bloody saga. The ripple effects of their actions contributed to a cycle of retribution that claimed lives on both sides and plunged Dublin into years of turmoil. Economically, the Wilson family's operation left their own mark. Their participation in Ireland's narcotic trade fed addiction, crime, and societal decay. The coke shipments they facilitated found their way into the streets, devastated individuals and families alike. Communities grappling with poverty and limited resources were disproportionately affected, as addiction rates soared and crime became a daily reality. The profits the Wilsons amassed came at a staggering human cost. The Wilsons also left a legacy of distrust and corruption within institutions. Their use of bribes and intimidation to shield their operations exposed vulnerabilities in the systems meant to protect society. While authorities ultimately dismantled their empire, the challenges of infiltrating and prosecuting their networks underscored the immense difficulty in combating organised crime. The Wilsons exploited these weaknesses to their advantage for years, and their story became a cautionary tale for institutions seeking to prevent similar criminal enterprises. On a personal level, the Wilsons family's collapse left its surviving members fragmented and vulnerable. Alan Wilson, once the orchestrator of meticulous plots, found himself embroiled in lawsuits and overshadowed by his diminished power. Luke Wilson, the eager heir to the family's legacy, faced a future defined by his convictions and the permanent injuries he sustained. Eric and Keith Wilson, serving lengthy sentences in foreign and domestic prisons, became isolated figures whose influence waned over time. Despite their decline, the Wilsons remain a stark reminder of the devastation wrought by organised crime. Their story is one of ambition turned to greed, loyalty eroded by betrayal, and violence that consumed not just their enemies, but their own family. For those who suffered at their hands, justice may have been served, but the scars they left behind are bitter reminders of the human cost of the reign of terror. Each Wilson faced varying degrees of justice for their crimes. While some charges were dropped due to plea bargains or lack of evidence, others led to convictions that effectively ended their reign of terror. These stories demonstrate the challenges of prosecuting organised crime figures and the resilience of the authorities in pursuing justice. The story of the Wilson family is a grave reminder of the devastating impact of organised crime. From the streets of Ballyfermot to the fortified walls of Ireland's high-security prisons, their saga illustrates how ambition, greed and violence can spiral into an unstoppable force of destruction. For years, they operated with a level of impunity that struck fear into the hearts of their victims and rivals alike. Yet, as their empire grew, so did the scrutiny of the authorities and the cracks within their own network. Alan, Eric, Keith, Luke and John Wilson each played a pivotal role in the family's criminal reign, leaving behind a trail of victims, shattered communities and irreparable damage. Their actions weren't merely isolated incidents of violence, but part of a broader pattern that exploited vulnerable neighbourhoods and fed into larger criminal organisations like the Kinahan Cartel. At the height of their power, the Wilsons were symbols of ruthless efficiency, blending intimidation, corruption and calculated brutality to consolidate their influence. But as much as their rise was marked by violence and fear, their fall was driven by their own mistakes. Surveillance recordings, discarded cigarette butts, incriminating boasts and betrayals within their ranks provided authorities with the tools they needed to bring the Wilsons to justice. The family's inability to adapt to increased scrutiny and their reliance on old methods in a changing world ultimately sealed their fate. For the Wilson family, their empire of fear and violence crumbled under the weight of their own hubris. For Ireland, their fall is both a victory and a call to action, to address the systemic issues that allow such figures to rise and rebuild the communities they devastated. The story of the Wilsons may have reached its conclusion, but its lessons will endure for generations. It is a stark reminder of the cost of unchecked ambition and the enduring strength of justice.